Chapter 6, Part 1 of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. In the autumn of 1847, shortly after leaving the hut at Walden, Thoreau again took up his residence at Emerson's house and lived there a year during his friend's absence in Europe, in order to keep Mrs. Emerson company and take charge of the garden. He was in the habit of assisting Mr. Alcott in garden work on his estate at Hillside, and in 1847 the two friends and fellow workers had built Emerson a summer house to be used as a study. Early in October, Thoreau accompanied Emerson to Boston to see him start on his voyage, and in a letter to his sister Sophia he feelingly described the appearance and dimensions of the philosopher's cabin, and how, instead of a walk in Walden woods, he would be compelled to promenade on deck, where the few trees, you know, are stripped of their bark. Emerson, on his part, was not forgetful of Thoreau during his visit to England, and we find him planning in 1848 a new joint American and English magazine, to which Thoreau was to be one of the chief contributors. After Emerson's return to Concord in 1849, Thoreau lived at his father's house in the village, and this continued to be his home for the rest of his life. He had now begun to consider literature his regular occupation, and it was as a writer and lecturer that he was henceforth chiefly known. We have seen that during his literary novitiate he had contributed articles, unpaid for the most part, to the Dial and other journals, and in 1847, by the kind services of Horace Greeley, his essay on Carlyle was printed in Graham's Magazine. This was followed in 1849 by the essay on Civil Disobedience, an expression of his anarchist views which found place in the Boston aesthetic papers. In the spring of the same year he took a more daring and important step by the publication of his first volume, The Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which was issued at the author's expense by Monroe, a Boston bookseller. The book was well reviewed, but did not sell, and the result was that Thoreau was compelled to raise money to pay off the debt by devoting his time for an unusually long period to the more remunerative but less congenial task of surveying. An edition of 1,000 copies had been printed, and for several years the bulk of these lay idle on the publisher's shelves, until, in 1853, the remaining 700 volumes were returned en masse to the author. This event was recorded by Thoreau in his characteristic vein of dry humor, and with a manly courage and self-reliance not to be surpassed in the history of literary authorship. The wares are sent to me at last, and I have an opportunity to examine my purchase. They are something more substantial than fame, as my back knows, which has borne them up 2 flights of stairs to a place similar to that to which they trace their origin. Of the remaining 290 and odd, 75 were given away, the rest sold. I have now a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself. Is it not well that the author should behold the fruits of his labor? My works are piled up in my chamber half as high as my head, my opera omnia. This is authorship. These are the work of my brain. There was just one piece of good luck in the venture. The unbound were tied up by the printer 4 years ago in stout paper wrappers and inscribed H. D. Thoreau's Concord River, 50 copies. So Monroe had only to cross out river and write Mass, and deliver them to the expressman at once. I can see now what I write for, and the result of my labors. Nevertheless, in spite of this result, sitting beside the inert mass of my works, I take up my pen tonight to record what thought or experience I may have had with as much satisfaction as ever. Indeed, I believe that this result is more inspiring and better than if 1,000 had bought my wares. It affects my privacy less and leaves me freer. That the week should at first have failed to win the favor of any but a few sympathetic readers can hardly be a matter of surprise, since its intense idealism and strongly pantheistic tone were ill calculated to conciliate the ordinary American mind. Purporting to be a record of the trip made by the two brothers in 1839, it was in reality an outpouring of its author's ideal philosophy on a great variety of topics, a number of essays and poems, mostly reprints from the Dial, being interwoven, in the most arbitrary manner, with the thread of the nominal subject. The book is thus rendered vague, disjointed, and discursive, and is, moreover, almost arrogant in its transcendental egoism. Yet, with all its deficiencies, it has, and must ever have, a great and indefinable charm for the lovers of Thoreau's genius. Its very lack of cohesion and entire disregard of method contribute to enhance the effect of its poetical mysticism and brilliant descriptive power, while several of the discourses introduced into it, notably those on friendship and religion, are written in Thoreau's most admirable and telling style. Footnote: The Athenaeum of 27th of October 1849 contained a brief notice of the week. "The matter is, for the most part, poor enough," said the reviewer, "but there are a few things in the volume, scattered here and there, which suggest that the writer is a man with a habit of original thinking." End footnote. In the autumn of 1849, Thoreau accompanied a friend on an excursion to the wild, sandy tract of Cape Cod, for which he conceived so great a liking that he visited again on several occasions. In like manner, he spent a week in Canada, with Ellery Channing as his fellow traveler, in September 1850. Each of these excursions provided material for a series of articles in Putnam's Magazine, but both came to an abrupt conclusion owing to misunderstandings between author and publisher, a mishap to which Thoreau's outspoken tone and uncompromising temper made him peculiarly liable. His visit to the Maine woods in 1846 was described in the Union Magazine 2 years later, and he again went to Maine in 1853 and 1857. Footnote: For an account of these excursions, see Chapter 7. End footnote. These occasional excursions were a great pleasure to Thoreau, as extending the circle of his observations without putting any restriction on his freedom. But he still resolutely declined to extend his travels to more distant regions, in spite of the offers he sometimes received from admirers and friends who wished to take him round the world at their own cost. Believing that the far-fetched is of least value, he asserted that the sight of a marsh hawk in the Concord meadows was of more interest to him than the entry of the Allies into Paris. It is easy to laugh at this deliberate concentration of thought on a particular locality, but a study of Thoreau's life inclines one to believe that he gauged correctly the peculiar strength and the peculiar weakness of his shy and sensitive genius. The course of his life at Concord was singularly quiet and uneventful. Always an affectionate son and brother, he lived contentedly as a member of the household of his father, who, with his assistance, had now built himself a dwelling of his own and was no longer a tenant. Thoreau's study was in the garret, where he stored his collections of birds' eggs, botanical specimens, and Indian relics, and carried on his literary work. His regard for his father was in no wise diminished by the dissimilarity of their characters, a contrast which is illustrated by some suggestive passages in the journal. On one occasion we find a protest made by the quiet, unobtrusive, but eminently practical old man against what he considered a waste of time on the part of his more imaginative son, who was busying himself in making sugar from a neighboring maple grove when he could have bought it cheaper at the village shop. To his father's remark that it took him from his studies, Thoreau made the characteristic answer that it was his study, and that after being engaged in this pursuit he felt as if he had been to a university. Mrs. Thoreau, who was of the same age as her husband, retained all her dramatic vivacity of manner, love of society, and extraordinary power of talk. It is said that when his mother began to talk at table, Thoreau would patiently remain silent until she had finished, and then, with a courteous obeisance, resume the thread of his conversation at the point where it had been interrupted. In 1849, the family circle suffered a heavy loss in the death of Helen, Thoreau's elder sister, whose character, like that of the brother who died 7 years earlier, was full of ability and promise. It was about this time that Thoreau became acquainted with Mr. Harrison G.O. Blake, a clergyman and tutor residing at Worcester, Massachusetts, with whom he corresponded largely from 1848 onwards, chiefly on subjects connected with his ideal method of thought. Mr. Blake has kindly furnished me with the following reminiscences of his friendly intercourse with Thoreau. I was introduced to him first by Mr. Emerson more than 40 years ago, though I had known him by sight before at college. I recall nothing of that first interview, unless it be some remarks upon astronomy and his want of interest in the study as compared with studies relating more directly to this world, remarks such as he has made here and there in his writings. My first real introduction was from the reading of an article of his in the Dial on Aulus Pursius Flaccus, which appears now in the Week. That led to my first writing to him, and to his reply, which is published in the volume of letters. Our correspondence continued for more than 12 years, and we visited each other at times, he coming here to Worcester, commonly to read something in public, or being on his way to read somewhere else. As to the outward incidents of our intercourse, I think of little or nothing that it seems worth while to write. Our conversation, or rather his talking when we were together, was in the strain of his letters and of his books. Our relation, as I look back on it, seems almost an impersonal one, and illustrates well his remark that our thoughts are the epochs in our lives. All else is but as a journal of the winds that blew while we were here. His personal appearance did not interest me particularly, except as the associate of his spirit, though I felt no discord between them. When together, we had little inclination to talk of personal matters. His aim was directed so steadily and earnestly towards what is essential in our experience, that beyond all others of whom I have known, he made but a single impression on me. Geniality, versatility, personal familiarity are, of course, agreeable in those about us, and seem necessary in human intercourse, but I did not miss them in Thoreau, who was, while living, and is still in my recollection in what he has left to us, such an effectual witness to what is highest and most precious in life. As I re-read his letters from time to time, which I never tire of doing, I am apt to find new significance in them, am still warned and instructed by them, with more force occasionally than ever before. So that, in a sense, they are still in the mail, have not altogether reached me yet, and will not probably before I die. They may well be regarded as addressed to those who can read them best. In addition to his pedestrian excursions, Thoreau paid occasional visits to Cambridge and Boston, the attraction at the former place being the university library, from which, owing to the insistence with which he petitioned the librarian and president, he was permitted unusual privileges in the taking out of books. At Boston, he was fond of studying the books of the Natural History Society and walking on the Long Wharf. The rest was barrels. Salem, too, he sometimes visited as a guest of Hawthorne, who had left Concord in 1846, and he lectured once or twice at the Salem Lyceum, of which Hawthorne was the secretary. One other journey he had about this time, of a more mournful character. In July 1850, when Margaret Fuller, who had become the wife of the Marquis of Ossory, was shipwrecked on her return from Italy and drowned off the coast of Fire Island, near New York, Thoreau and her other friends hurried to the scene of the disaster to assist in the vain attempt to recover her body. Though Thoreau had now attained a certain recognized position as a writer, he was still compelled to earn the greater part of his means of subsistence by pencil-making or land surveying. This last employment, or rather the company into which his employment brought him, was very far from being a congenial one. On such occasions he was no longer the poet, naturalist, and idealist, but merely Thoreau the surveyor, as he informs his friend Blake. Lecturing was probably a more agreeable occupation, though here too he speaks of himself as simply their hired man, while his candor occasionally placed him in strained relations towards his audience. Though he several times made his mark on the platform, the more usual result was to puzzle and bewilder those who heard him. He was a poor lecturer, says Joseph Hosmer. He had no magnetism, and only gave simple dry details, as though he was before a jury to give his evidence under oath. Hence he never succeeded as a platform or lyceum speaker, which I think he desired to be. In the autumn of 1852, Thoreau met Arthur Hugh Clough, who had come over to Boston with Thackeray, and thence paid Emerson a visit at Concord. "Walk with Emerson to a wood with a prettyish pool," writes Clough in his diary for the 14th of November, the pool being presumably Walden. "Concord is very bare. It is a small sort of village, almost entirely of wood houses painted white, with Venetian blinds, green outside, with 2 white wooden churches. There are some American elms and sycamores, i.e. planes, but the wood is mostly pine, white pine and yellow pine, somewhat scrubby, occupying the tops of the low banks and marshy hayland between. A little brook runs through to the Concord River. At 6:30, tea and Mr. Thoreau, and presently Mr. Ellery Channing, Miss Channing, and others. It was in this same year that Nathaniel Hawthorne returned to Concord and took up his residence at Hillside, now renamed Wayside, an estate which had been for some years in Alcott's possession, and on which Thoreau and Alcott had done a great deal of manual work in constructing terraces and summer houses. End of Chapter 6, Part 1.